Welcome to Fortress on a Hill. I'm Henry.
I'm Danny.
I'm Keagan.
We're three leftist veterans that aim to expose the reality of the U.S. military's multiple wars abroad and to illuminate the damage military service does to Americans.
American presidents throughout U.S. history have used American military and diplomatic power to force regime change of democratically elected governments around the world.
Most veterans come from families vested in prior service, and American generals choose their own, ensuring diversity of thought never interferes with American warmongering.
How can we stand by and do nothing while our military kills and destroys lives the world over, while telling Americans that all this death and destruction protects them from terrorists when nothing could be more false?
Fortress on a Hill aims to change that.
All right, listeners, we are past the election. We are past all the social media hate mail about daring to criticize or factually point out and play videos of Joe Biden's foreign policy record. Henry and I have burned the secret MAGA hats that so many of you thought we had in our closets. So you can't prove it anymore, just like the CIA can't be proved to have done waterboarding. Okay, we learned from the best and we're putting it into practice. But all kidding aside, the election's through. We here on the pod and out in the streets and out in the movement are big proponents of the idea that nothing stops, right? The fight for reorienting foreign policy, bringing decency, empathy, and just humanity into what we do as a nation overseas and the way it boomerangs back home. That doesn't change on November, 2nd, 3rd, whatever day it was. And there's a lot of work to be done. Our guests are going to kind of reflect that. It's business as usual over here in the fight. And we're just coming through Veterans Day. We're recording on Friday the 13th. And so we're 2 days past what's become really like a week of Veterans Day, at least for those of us who are vets and somewhat public in, our pontification, because we get a lot of calls and appearances, and it does feel like a week. And staying in line with what's been a heck of a run of guests. I mean, really since the new year, but especially over the last several months, we are bringing on a TomDispatch regular who I followed for a long time. Henry's read his stuff for a long time. It's a weird world where you make your living digitally, or you have your fun online digitally, and so you feel like you know all of these different kinds of folks, and you don't know any of them in person. In fact, William Astore, he was on a Zoom call with me for, full disclosure, the Eisenhower Media Network. We've mentioned he's one of our senior fellows. We had a meet and greet, just last week, and it was like kind of the first time you hear somebody's voice, really, or you see their face, and hopefully we'll do more of that in person. But he's been writing with TomDispatch, which means, of course, that he's been writing, for The Nation and Salon and all the regular reposts for quite some time. And we're super glad to have him on. So before I kind of jump into the usual journey, life, love, liberty question, I just want to let the listeners know a little bit about Bill and, where he's coming from on paper, right? The bios that we can all pick up. So, Bill was a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Air Force. He was there for 20 years. He retired as a lieutenant colonel. He retired in 2005, which is interesting. That's the year I graduated the academy. And so it's kind of funny how he left the business and I picked it up, and boy, has it turned out great. So I think it was us who had all these stellar victories, Bill. But beyond that, he's done a lot of stuff. Okay. So professor of history, he's written for TomDispatch, which means all over, but also Truth Out, History News Network, been at Alternet, antiwar.com, the usual. He's the author or the co-author of 3 books, Soldiers' Lives Through History, The Early Modern World, and that's 2007 with Dennis Showalter, who I've actually read a whole bunch over the years.
Yeah, Dennis Showalter is a great guy and great military historian. And not to interrupt you, Danny, but unfortunately, we lost Dennis Showalter. I think a few months ago. He died, natural causes, and I just want to give him a shout out if I can. He worked with me on the Hindenburg book that I wrote, and just a great guy.
I'm sorry to hear that. I didn't know that, but his work had been assigned at, I think, West Point and the Command and General Staff College over the years. So even if beyond my own reading, I mean, he was super respected and assigned across the board, which is really a great writer. So but yeah, so he did the Hindenburg book, and also, right, kind of a different topic, another book called Observing God, Thomas Dick, Evangelicalism and Popular Science in Victorian Britain and America. And Bill, maybe we'll find a way to tie that stuff in, because I love it when people have broad ranges of interest and scholarship. But he's taught at the Air Force Academy, the Naval Postgraduate School, Pennsylvania College of Technology. He's got a doctor of philosophy. He's got a master's from Johns Hopkins, and a whole bunch of experience in the military, and a whole bunch more experience since then, doing what so many of us do, which is, mechanically reading the news and trying to say something meaningful about it as best as possible. So, Bill, thanks so much for coming on, and thanks for letting me flatter you for a sec there.
Yeah. Oh, thanks so much for having me, Danny.
It's such a kind of cliche platitude hybrid to start interviews with, tell us about you and your life. But I don't know, when we do it, I choose to believe it's not, which is, I'm an American male, which means that delusion is my birthright. So I can do that. But I do think that there's value in someone kind of describing their journey that's not on paper, right? The stuff that's not necessarily in the bio underneath the articles, and what brought them to the military, what's brought them to the place they're at, both intellectually, ethically, professionally, or just personally. So yeah, Bill, just tell us anything you want to tell us about how you got here.
Hey, thanks. I guess, when I look back growing up, I always had an interest in the military, and especially the Air Force. Growing up in the 1970s, I built a lot of models. I'm not sure how popular that is nowadays, but you remember all those models you could buy and make, tanks, airplanes, and the like. Well, I love to make model airplanes. I remember one of them. I built the B-1 bomber, and then I grew up in Massachusetts and lived in a triple decker, and so launched the B-1 off the third floor porch with a firecracker, and the plane blew up, and I was very happy, which doesn't sound very American. That was right around the time that Jimmy Carter canceled the B-1, and I thought, oh my God, a president that actually took on the military-industrial complex. But lo and behold, when Ronald Reagan became president, the B-1 was resuscitated, and it goes to show you that even when a president cancels a major weapon system, sometimes they come back, as Stephen King wrote in a short story. It's difficult to take on the Pentagon and the military-industrial complex, as you well know. But I digress. I just always been interested in the military. I joined up through ROTC. I went to Worcester Polytechnic Institute, and I got my degree in engineering, and I went into the Air Force in 1985. And my first assignment was to Air Force Space Command in Cheyenne Mountain, and that was really eye-opening. I've written about that for The Nation and for TomDispatch. Leaving Cheyenne Mountain was the title of the article, and because that was I would go inside the mountain under 2,000 feet of solid granite. That was our nuclear, our sort of our mine shaft, if you will. if everyone remembers Dr. Strangelove, it was a safe place to be. Of a nuclear war, or at least we thought it was in the 1960s when Cheyenne Mountain was built. And then Soviet ICBMs became more accurate, and Cheyenne Mountain probably would have been among the first targets if we ever came to a nuclear exchange. But fortunately, that did not happen. So I started as an engineer, but then the Air Force Academy decided that they wanted to sponsor an engineer to get a master's degree in the history of science and technology. And I was the guy who was picked. So I went off and got my master's at Johns Hopkins. And then after teaching at the Air Force Academy in the history department for 2 years, the Academy had, that I didn't even know, but they had an exchange program with Oxford. And I competed for that and was picked. And so they sent me to Oxford to get my my doctorate. And I taught some more at the Air Force Academy, had some other assignments. And my last assignment before I retired was the Associate Provost and Dean of Students at the Defense Language Institute, Foreign Language Center, and at the Presidio of Monterey. And that, in a way, was an eye-opening assignment because we were, this is right after 9/11, and we were standing up a lot of, we stood up, or created, as civilians would say, but how we in the military, we talk about standing up, we stood up a new school for Arabic language training. We had a OEF, Operation Enduring Freedom task force. We're creating all these new training programs in languages like Pashto and Dari. And all of this was for the GWAT, the Global War on Terror. So that was a very interesting assignment at the end of my career, being involved in trying to help out the troops who are being sent, because as you know, Danny, better than I do, seeing combat, we're at a big disadvantage, just like they were in Vietnam. We send them to Afghanistan and Iraq, wherever. They can't speak the language. And so you can't speak the language. All you do is end up shouting at people in English, or you end up pointing guns at them and otherwise assaulting them verbally and sometimes physically. And being able to speak the language in a so-called, coin or counterinsurgency is absolutely essential. And yet we were always at the Presidio of Monterey. We were always at the very end of the Army's food chain and could, barely get funding. I remember one time we, I think it was General Abizaid who visited, and that was a big deal because that was like, hey, the Presidio of Monterey is actually on the Army's radar as an important place. But anyway, I'm going on and on, but that's where I'm coming from.
Bill, did you say that you got to start your career in Colorado Springs and end it in Monterey?
That's right.
I mean, I don't know what you're complaining about on TomDispatch all the time. I mean, that's no. I mean, it's interesting how you bookended the career. My first duty station, after the basic course, was also Fort Carson, so I know.
Oh, right.
Cheyenne Mountain, and all that was kind of like the front view out of my house. There's a Pikes Peak and all that. It was a super interesting and fascinating town. I always tell people it's more of an Air Force town, despite the big Army base, just because there's 4 different Air Force sort of installations in the area.
Yeah, not to bore people, but you have Peterson Air Force Base, you have Schriever, which is probably under the Space Force now. I'm not sure about that. Of course, you have the Air Force Academy, and of course Cheyenne Mountain, which I think was mothballed, but maybe reactivated again. I'm now, since I've been retired 15 years, some of my knowledge has expired, so to speak.
No, I mean, I think I heard that as well, and it's funny how fast you can find yourself sort of falling out of the up-to-date knowledge. Some of my buddies who are still in will correct my acronyms and such in an article to say, "Oh, we don't call it that anymore," and then I always say, "But it's the same thing, right?" Right. I wanted to ask you about Abizaid real quick. So he came to visit when you were at Monterey, and I mean, I don't know at what level you were privy to what his thoughts were on things, but there was this moment right at that point in the end of your career, and when I was just coming in, where Abizaid was seen as one of the more sort of like urbane and intellectual types. I mean, he had spent time in Lebanon. I mean, he had spoken the language, I believe, or at least had done some duty over there. He was kind of thought of as a more internationalist officer as far as the Army goes. And I was wondering if, you had any, sort of interaction with him or thoughts on how he viewed not only DLI, but also just, in general, what you had made of him at the time?
Yeah, well, by coming to DLI, he was definitely making a statement about the importance of foreign language training. But unfortunately, his visit was kind of hush hush. And when he came, I think he was hosted by the commandant and the army. And I believe it or not, I only heard about the visit after he had already gone. So maybe they were keeping the Air Force guy out. It might be an army thing to do, but no, I think Abizaid, had some good ideas. I think he was an improvement. That Sanchez, Ricardo Sanchez, was he the one?
Right.
Yeah, he was definitely an improvement. Over Sanchez, but the Iraq, the whole Iraq situation became so messy so quickly, and obviously again, you have the experience. Well, I was thinking today about when I was writing TomDispatch articles, saying that we needed to get out of Iraq or Afghanistan and criticizing the war effort. It was guys like you who are over there fighting the war effort that I was now writing against, and trying to, in a way, trying to make sure that guys like you weren't sent over there. And you can see how well I succeeded.
Well, I know that Camus has kind of become the cliche in midst of a pandemic, right? But the struggle itself, right? The struggle itself is enough to warm a man's heart. You were in the rare group that actually cared to do it, especially from the military perspective, from within the military ranks or the retired military ranks. But it is interesting to think about that. Someone else we both, know of and know to some extent, Andy Basovich.
Yes.
I may have known, for example, that his son was killed before he did. I don't know. I basically was able to figure out, and I didn't know him at the time, but I had read his book, actually, The New American Militarism, right? Because he was writing about the war, even really just before you, right? Just before you retired, he was really making a splash to some extent. And so anyway, I was able to figure out through, we do the battle roster numbers or whatever, and you see the different units, and I was able to figure out the name or whatever. And I figured that's not that common of a name, right? And figured, oh man, that's probably, his son or his nephew. I didn't really know much about Basovich's personal life at that time, but it is interesting to think about where we all were, kind of where are they now and where were they then, about that period. And it's interesting talking about Abizaid because some of those generals, I think, and how they viewed things and what they thought, what they said, have been lost. Like a lot of that history, it feels like ancient history. For example, the Iraq surge or even the Afghan surge feel like ancient history, but they really weren't that long ago. And before Petraeus comes in, and largely through kind of self-styling, right, and his whole thing of just unapologetic, like ego boosting and reputation building, but he sort of whitewashed everybody before him and said nobody else got it, right? And I'm going to fix it all. And people bought that for a long time. And to some extent, the neoliberal sort of think tank crowd still thinks that, right? They still hold him up. But Abizaid was actually saying, Abizaid was saying, look, don't surge, right? We need to start transitioning. And that's interesting because that's totally forgotten. And it's also, they made him out to sound like boneheads, but Abizaid probably knew more about the region than any of the other generals on the staff at the time, right?
Yeah, I think so. I honestly, I don't know it. I don't know the situation that well, but yeah, I mean, the whole thing with Petraeus is how I started writing for TomDispatch to begin with, because that was my first article in 2007. When things were really going bad in Iraq, and then all of a sudden, the General Petraeus is kind of announced as King David, as the savior of the situation in Iraq for the Bush Cheney administration, and so I saw him giving testimony before Congress, basically saying this is how it think a little bit back to William Westmoreland appearing before Congress and congressional committees, and basically, with those various metrics, like body count, explaining, this is how we're going to win, and just as LBJ Johnson was hiding behind the be-mettled chest and manly visage of William Westmoreland. I mean, Bush Cheney ended up hiding behind Petraeus, and it just really offended me as a retired military officer that I saw Bush Cheney as abdicating their responsibility. They're the ones who are supposed to explain, as the civilian leaders of the commander in chief. I saw it as their responsibility, but here they are, giving us General Petraeus, and basically, in a way, Petraeus was peddling, convenient lies. I guess instead of the inconvenient truth of Al Gore, the convenient lies of David Petraeus that we can win this thing. Although he always couched it in terms, and you'll recall this, the progress was always fragile and reversible. He always used those terms.
Right.
And so is, of course, as but Petraeus's background, he had been in charge of training the Iraqi military. Like a couple years before he became the overall, commander there, CENTCOM, whatever. And he had not done well at that job. And of course, the Iraqi military, the training was always pretty much a disaster, as we discovered, when that military collapsed, under assault, and what was that, 2013. And so Petraeus is so much of what he accomplished was, he was right. It was definitely fragile and irreversible, as events proved.
It's so interesting the way guys like that tend to rise, and I'm sure that you saw it even in the Air Force just as well. It's there are good people who rise. I mean, I really do try not to just do hyperbole, right, or just do generalization, but to a large extent, it's remarkable the sorts of people who end up in many of those positions. And Petraeus was a particularly unique self-promoter. And one of the ways he did that, it seems, well, two of the ways that I notice, one that you mentioned is he's very cautious about his language, always kind of having an out for himself, saying a lot without saying anything in many cases. And then he also made decisions throughout his career, I don't know, he probably loves her and everything, but, a lot of people looked at it from the start and said, geez, the guy married the superintendent's daughter after he graduated West Point. But beyond that, he's actually worked pretty hard, and he still does, to whitewash inconvenient past, almost like something in one of these, Orson Welles type, old films, right? Like the skeletons that get shoved into the closet and the whitewashing failure throughout. It's, did you find in your career that certain types of officers tended to rise, and whether or not how you viewed the archetypes to the extent that there were any?
Yeah. As you know, I've written about this. I think, and this yourself, there's when you look at officers, especially the flag officers, generals and admirals, those officers identified fairly early in their careers, and they're sort of mentored. They're given certain choice assignments. They're carefully watched and in a way groomed for stars. And I didn't even, I retired as lieutenant colonel. I didn't have a lot of exposure to general officers. I met some good ones, and there are others though who obviously won promotion because they were. I like to say they're true believers. They believe in their particular service branch. They put loyalty to their bosses and to the service above. I would say they put it above loyalty to the Constitution or they really don't see the difference between the two. And I think that's very dangerous. Obviously, their interests become narrow and parochial, and they lose sight of the real purpose of being in the military, which is, again, as you know, we're always, every time we're promoted, we swear the oath of office again. And we know that's all about supporting and defending the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. It's about the Constitution. It's about our freedoms and liberties, and protecting our democracy. That's why we serve.
You know, I think it's interesting what you raised there, because when you say things like that I agree with, and that I say constantly, you know, about the rise, I find that at least I tend to get two pushbacks, and one of them is, what do you know, you couldn't make it, right, kind of thing, like, yo, you didn't make it past major, you didn't make it past lieutenant colonel, so you're sour grapes, you know. And then yeah, go ahead.
No, yeah, that's true. I would not have made general. I would not have made flag rank myself. I may have been able to reach the rank of full colonel, possibly. You know, I was an engineer. I was not a pilot. You know, being in the Air Force, you know, obviously it helps if you're a pilot, or what's called a rated officer. You know, you have wings. It gives you an advantage in promotion. But you know, the Air Force promotes a lot of other officers, you know, to general rank, other than pilots. But I was happy, to be honest. I was happy serving for 20 years. I reached the rank that I wanted to reach. You know, I made all my normal promotions, hit all my gates, you know, whatever. And after 20 years, I'd had enough, to be honest. And my wife and I, you know, we were tired of moving every 2 or 3 years. And even though, as you said, most of my assignments weren't that bad. You know, I wasn't in Fallujah or Kandahar. You know, I was in Monterey and in Colorado Springs. But even so, you get tired of moving. And so, you know, yeah. No, it's just like you. I would love to see a Brigadier General Danny. But you know, I know your career, and I know that you had the integrity to speak out, and your career ended as a major, you know, because you chose a path of a much more difficult path, and I'd go so far as to say a courageous path, in the sense that you were speaking out before you retired, whereas I really didn't start speaking out until after I retired. And so all credit to you. Not that you need me singing your praises, but seriously, I was very impressed. I remember when Tom Engelhart said, "Hey, I got a new guy. You know, he's going to be writing for TomDispatch. He's still a serving Army major." And I think the first thing I said to Tom was, I said, I hope he's careful, because you know, I'm retired, so it's a little safer for me to speak out. It's not as easy when you're still in the military to speak out. So I'm sure you've talked a lot about it, but it must have been difficult for you. You must have felt like people were ostracizing you, or stepping away from you, or keeping their distance. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, no, I mean, obviously, I appreciate that, and it's a funny thing about it. I think people like us who at least try to live our values, and I think "try" is the key word for all of us, right? I'm littered with hypocrisy. Is that we have a tendency, we always feel like we're not doing enough. You know, it's, sometimes I'll be talking to, you know, some of like the serious whistleblowers, even in the EMN crowd, right? You know, among our senior fellows, and I'm like, geez, I did nothing, you know, when I was on active duty compared to these people. And of course, I was teasing about the assignments and everything. And when I was bringing up with you, you know, that often people will say, like, you couldn't make it. Obviously, that's not my view of you, or even myself to a certain extent, although I had my own limitations that were mostly mental health oriented, frankly, but that probably would have held me back anyway. but it's interesting how that's one angle that they go to, and then the second angle that they go to, and then I'll just circle back to what you were just saying. But the other angle they often go to is, oh, like you're overgeneralizing. You know, these people can't all just care about their careers. And one of the things that I often try to plug in there is I say, no, it's very important to understand that I think a lot of them make this deal with themselves in their head where they say, look, I might have to make some compromises, but it's worth it because it's better that, you know, I'm in charge because I'm principled and I mean well. And so I've got to do what I've got to do to get to the top so I can make changes within the inside.
Right.
And I believe that for a long time, even at my lower and mid-level. And I let people convince me of it. And, you know, I had bosses who I did respect who would say, no, you've got to stay, right? You've got to stay.
Right.
Last point on that, though, I'm obviously I'm the interviewer, not their interviewee, but this is Sports on a Hill where we just say whatever the heck we want. You know, it's funny, when I started writing for Tom, I had zero fucks left to give, frankly. And so in many ways, I was like the serial killer that wants to get caught, maybe. I don't know. But actually what was interesting about it was how long before anyone really noticed. You know, and I think it's partly because alternative media, even fairly prominent alternative media like TomDispatch, you can actually stay under the radar for a while. I had already written and published the book on active duty before I ever emailed Tom, and nobody really noticed, but they did have a book signing at the West Point bookstore in my building where I was teaching, and nobody got mad. You know, there's one colonel who yelled at me, but it was like nothing. So it was interesting how that worked. But then you're right, though, once it was public, once someone complained, and it only takes one like 06 or something, you know, to call IG, it gets ugly, of course. And I think what you noted is important because you may have seen it at the very end or even in retirement, I imagine, but most of the pressure isn't overt or legal. It's like, you know, suddenly you're a little bit of a black sheep, right? Suddenly people keep their distance and they warn you, and they, you know, it's funny how a lot of it is like a social ostracization as much as anything else. I mean, I had my friends who were my boys regardless, you know, and I wasn't worried about that, but the polite, you know, cocktail party circle, so to speak, within the military definitely gets kind of ugly.
Right. Yeah, I mean, maybe in a way it was, I suppose it was easier for me in the sense that, you know, after leaving the military, and instead of, you know, say going to the Washington Beltway and getting some kind of consultant job or going to work for Lockheed Martin or General Dynamics or whatever, you know, I got an academic job. I taught history at the Pennsylvania College of Technology. It's kind of in a rural area in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, which is probably best known as the host of the Little League World Series.
Yes.
Yeah. So, you know, I was kind of in obscurity, and you know, there were no military bases around me. You know, my new friends were acquaintances, were academics for the most part, and so, you know, there wasn't the sense that, oh my God, if I start writing critical stuff, you know, what's my employer going to say? You know, what's my think tank going to say? What's my military contractor going to say? So I didn't have that kind of fear, but I do remember, you know, even before my first article for TomDispatch, I actually emailed my dean and said, hey, I have an article coming out. You know, it's a little bit critical of the military. You just in case, you know, I didn't want to, you know, it's like, remember the chain of command. You never want to blindside your boss. So, and in my case, my dean had actually been in the CIA, and had some Army experience as well. So, you know, he wasn't fazed at all by this. But yeah, I don't see, like, if you take one of these jobs that, you know, in the Beltway as part of the military industrial complex, you know, it almost goes without saying that you really can't speak out like we do, or you'll quickly find that your contract is not renewed.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, and I think I would take not only being able to look myself in the mirror, but also not to have to worry about who I ask before I do what I do, especially since I can hardly hold my tongue. I think that would be difficult. But, you know, pivoting, you know, a bit, we just came through Veterans Day, and it sounds like a totally off base transition, but I wonder sometimes if it really is, because, and I'm going to let Henry kind of, handle this portion. He's got some interesting thoughts here, but as we talk about the senior generals and some of the self-promotion and stuff like that, there's a part of me that wonders about, societal, overadulation and how that maybe affects all of us as we move forward. But anyway, Henry, jump in. That was just my little plug that was in my head.
Oh, that's all good. The guys and I love doing the podcast. Being able to share our experiences in the military with allies and supporters means the world to us. But we can't do all the work. We need you to share an episode of ours with someone, anyone whom you might think would be affected by it. Young people looking to join the military or parents advocating for one, conscientious citizens who care about the violence the U.S. wages in their name, advocates for women and people of color who understand the harsh environment the military creates for minorities and inflicts on minorities across the globe, and anyone else you think it might affect. Please take a moment and share this with them. Our podcast is supported in a few different ways. First, there's Patreon, where we're blessed to have an array of wonderful supporters, helping the guys and I pay for some of the podcast's expenses. Those who contribute $10 a month or more will be mentioned right here as an honorary producer, helping keep you, our listeners, stocked with new episodes. But you don't have to contribute $10 a month to help us. For as little as $1 a month, you can help keep us going, paying for hosting and storage fees, transcribing old and new episodes, promoting and expanding the podcast, and more I'm sure I can't think of at the moment. So let's bring out our honorary producers, and they are Will Arens, Fahim Shirazi, James O'Barr, Adam Bellows, Eric Phillips, Paul Appel, Julie Dupree, Thomas Benson, Emma P., Janet Hansen, Tristan Oliver, Daniel Fleming, Michael Karen, Jason, Zach H., Ren Jacob, and the Status Quo podcast. Your contributions are wonderfully helpful to us. Thank you so much. However, if Patreon isn't your style, you can contribute directly to us through PayPal at paypal.me/Fortress on a Hill. Or please check out our awesome store on Spreadshirt.com for some great Fortress merch. The link is in the show notes. And now, let's get back to the podcast. So, Bill, I really enjoyed your blog post for Veterans Day. Your detailed family history of military service reminded me a bit of my own family. What I wanted to talk about is that most Americans' impressions of war and how it impacts society, they never really leave the confines of a 4th of July parade or a 10-episode miniseries produced by Tom Hanks. But this, confined storytelling has a real cost, one that Veterans Day and even the term veteran demonstrate through their sanitized remembrance. Quote unquote, thank you for your service. For my part, has morphed into tell me about your service. And I think that should be
Right.
So it's a much better, easier standard for any profession that can easily fall into the hero worship category. But ideas like veteran worship about the premise of the thin blue line show us how hard it can be for veterans or for public servants in general with hero complexes to reach past all that notional support and see a more realistic view of whatever their service happens to be. Now, you've written it at TomDispatch about how the American hero worship machine these days covers soldiers, cops, firemen, doctors, to name a few professions, where we're told to simply worship, not have questions, not study things for ourselves, not take stock of the umbrella of death and damage that comes with it. The moment people remember without really remembering is the moment when unvarnished views are required. I have a quote here from The History Boys by Alan Bennett. Quote, "It's not less we forget, it's less we remember." That's what this is all about. The memorials, the cenotaph, the 2 minutes of silence, because there is no better way of forgetting something than by commemorating it. So, Bill, I was wondering if you would tell the listeners a bit about your own family's military experience and how you feel that led into your own, and also how you choose to remember their service and sacrifice.
Right. Yeah, my family's. I don't come from a strongly, like a real strong tradition of military service, but my father and his two brothers were all drafted in World War II. My father served in the army in an armored unit, and one of my uncles served in the Marine Corps. Uh, my uncle Freddie on my mother's side, he was actually at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was attacked. He was in the army, and they sent him to Guadalcanal, and that was one of the most bitter island campaigns of World War II, where he won the Bronze Star, but as an enlisted man. But I never really got to know my Uncle Freddie because he had got malaria, which is most of the guys got malaria fighting in the Pacific and places like Guadalcanal, and the malaria and probably PTSD from that combat led to a shortened life. So by the time I came along, years after that, and I really don't remember my Uncle Freddie at all. My brother enlisted in the Air Force right after the Vietnam War. I got another brother-in-law who actually was drafted to Vietnam and served as a radio operator for an artillery unit. So I had that background in my and in my family, which is probably why I decided when I was 17, 18, that and the fact that my father said that he wasn't going to pay for my college education. So I said, okay, Dad, I want to go to a fairly pricey private engineering school. I think I'll pursue an Air Force ROTC scholarship. And that's exactly what I did. And that's how I came to be in the Air Force. But that family military tradition pointed me in the direction of serving in the military. And it made sense to me at the time because we were involved in what I saw as the Cold War, right? A potentially cataclysmic struggle between ourselves and the Soviet Union. And it really seemed as if we needed a strong military to keep the Soviets and the Warsaw Pact at bay. And it also seemed in 1985 when I entered the military that the Soviet Union would be around forever. Certainly our intelligence agencies thought that way. And yet 4 years later, the Berlin Wall is falling. And by 1991, the Soviet Union is collapsing. So, I mean, that's one thing we need to keep in mind is, some of the verities, some of the things we take for granted today, I took for granted in 1985, like virtually everyone else in the military, that we'd always face this Soviet threat, a peer threat, and yet the Soviet Union collapsed 6 years later. And I think there's a lesson to be learned there. And those people who think that Russia today is somehow a threat, like the Soviet Union was in the 1980s, they should all have their heads examined. It's nothing like that at all. I'm really shocked in a way that we're witnessing a sort of new Cold War, where China and or Russia are being held up again as threats when they really aren't, or at least they're not threats in the way that they were when I entered the military in 1985. With respect to hero worship, I've written on this, and my sense is that, you talk to people in the military, like I talked to Lar about Vietnam. He laughs at that hero stuff. He's there. We weren't heroes. I wasn't a hero in Vietnam. He's just doing his job as an enlisted guy in the Army. Same with my dad. Same with everyone I've talked to. I'm sure it's the same with Danny. I haven't asked Danny this, but Danny's in combat. He lost men under his command. I think if somebody came up to Danny and said, "Hey, thanks, hero." I think Danny, not to put words in Danny's mouth, I think he'd say, "Hey, look, most veterans will say, number one, I'm not a hero, and number two, the heroes are the ones we leave behind." We do the real heroes a disservice by throwing that word around, so loosely. I am definitely not a hero, because the heroes in our lives are very rare people indeed.
Yeah, well, I mean, speak for yourself, Bill. I mean, I actually personally on Veterans Day now, I wear a shirt that says "You're welcome" for my service everywhere I go. It's because that's how I feel. No, I 100% agree with you. And I even make that dark joke because I do think that there is a seeping sense among some, not even maybe most veterans, that they've started to believe their own mythology that in many cases has been pushed upon them, that like, everybody's a hero. Biden has to end his speeches by saying, "God bless our troops." It's become like a verbal tick, and it's just this, it's almost like a fetishization. I think the problem with, too much of that positive reinforcement is that you can start to believe some of this nonsense, and I think that's not the instinct isn't that. I mean, most guys that I served with feel exactly the way you did, right? And they would say the same thing, like, no, my buddies that didn't come home are heroes, or even among them, it's a small number that were actually heroes according to like the clearer definition. But there is some of this that's going on, and I remember my grandmother when I got accepted to West Point. It was, in my little world, it was a big deal. There hadn't been a lot of college and even the extended family, and so like, West Point was considered like a big deal. And my grandfathers who'd been in World War II thought this was like, how could our enlisted selves create a grandson who could get into the academy? I thought you had to like know a congressman. And everybody was just adulating. I mean, I was just the golden child, as my sister calls it to this day. And my grandmother, who was just this brilliant little tiny woman who would have been like an English professor in another generation, but never even learned to drive a car or really had a job. Brilliant woman. And she just like called me over and she said, sit next to me. And I went over there and she said, "Don't get a big head. You're not that special." And like that was, and she adored me. But I mean, I think about that and I say, man, like we all need that in our lives a little more. And I think sometimes what you're describing, does get lost when there's too much public adulation or private,
Right. I totally agree.
So, before we go on, Bill, you mentioned about your Uncle Freddie. My Grandpa Ray survived Pearl Harbor. He was a Marine on the USS Tennessee, and he turned a fire hose onto an electrical conduit or cabinet that was on fire, and it shot him across the room. And
oh wow,
he came out of it relatively scot-free. I mean, he did have some injuries and was held up for a while, but I don't think there was any lingering issues from specifically that day. But he went on to fight in the Marshals, and then also served in Korea, and fought at the Chosin Reservoir.
oh wow.
And that's some of my family history. Is I have I believe most of my family have been volunteers, but that it goes back quite a ways, and it definitely the mythos of that looms large for me in some certain ways.
Right.
I wanted to pick out something from a recent piece about going on along in the same lines with hero worship. You had mentioned that U.S. military personnel are supposed to defend the Constitution, not wage wars or count lives taken as successes. how do you think we can move towards that notion? How do you think we can change or advocate for an ideal of remembrance that works towards legitimately honoring that notion, that it can be truly about upholding the ideal more than the people that are supposed to uphold it?
Yeah, I don't know. That's it's a it's a it's a difficult question. I think we as a country have to remember why we have a military to begin with. I think partly we need to. Well, I kind of have mixed feelings about this. I've written a lot about the citizen soldier tradition, and that's what I'd like to see the United States get back to. Nowadays we have this notion that, and the military encourages this whole idea that we all need to be warriors and war fighters, and in a way, it the idea is that we only exist to fight wars, which is nonsensical. If you're in a democracy, James Madison said that constant warfare is the enemy of democracy, because constant warfare just erodes away at democratic underpinnings. Constant warfare reinforces this idea that you need a unitary executive. And rather than having Congress declare war, basically presidents send the troops on what I would say is wars of choice that I think, if we were really honest, we would have to say are unconstitutional. So somehow we need to get back. We need to throw away this whole idea of the troops being war fighters and warriors. Get back to this notion of the citizen soldier. We need to get back to the notion of service. There's a lot more to being a service member than fighting wars, and being GI Joe, and mastering your weapon. That kind of narrow-minded idea of what it means to be a soldier. And again, it comes back to the oath of office. I don't know if that answers your question, but we seem to have, as a country, we've sort of lost our center, so to speak.
Oh, that absolutely answers it. Yeah, we have gotten way too attached to slogans. This is very linear remembrance of what has happened and what needs to be focused on. And I think that the media just kind of, if that whole mentality of if it bleeds, it leads, they just push that so far to the front that ordinary people who say that they can't, that they can't understand military experience. They really can, but I understand the assumption. Danny, I lost my train of thought there. Why don't you go ahead and jump in?
Yeah. Well, I think some of this relates, actually, believe it or not. It kind of worked out to your latest TomDispatch piece, which was reclaiming American idealism. We could use a leader like George McGovern again. I liked this article a lot for a number of reasons, partly because I'm kind of a George McGovern groupie, which Bill, we might be the only two left. But really, I had written an article, I think, for Truthdig maybe like 3 years ago, called something like "Where Have You Gone, George McGovern?" And I'm a bit of an old soul and a romantic sort of idealist type. On Halloween, as sort of a joke, I have like a cut off George McGovern campaign shirt. I collect these like old fashioned campaign shirts because I'm a geek, but I only like Democrats who lost. That's kind of my niche market, so I got like a Mondale, but McGovern's my favorite. It's like a peace symbol, with the American flag inside the fingers, and it says McGovern 72. And I had like had my son take a picture of me on Halloween. I said, "Oh, it's Halloween, everybody! Happy Halloween! Break out your fantasy costumes. Mine is actual anti-war Democrat, And of course, I got some messages saying like, "Oh, this is right before the election. Are you trying to get Trump elected?" And I was like, I got to be able to make jokes, guys, But it wasn't even really a joke. So what I think was interesting, and it connects though, is you say at one point, like in the around the second page, you say that like so many combat veterans of the greatest generation, McGovern never bragged about his wartime exploits. And then you go on to basically describe why we need to broach even the conversation, the radical act, as I've been kind of calling it. And you inspired me to talk about this actually in our EMN Fellows meeting, the radical act of even saying the word peace. So I don't know, maybe you could just give us an idea of your interest in George McGovern, how his military service played in, and what you think we can kind of learn from him,
Right. I wish I'd actually been able to talk to George McGovern a little bit more, because I met him in 1990 at the Air Force Academy. We had a military history symposium on the Vietnam War, and he came to the Air Force Academy to participate in that. And I was sent. I was an errand boy, and makes me think of Apocalypse Now. But anyway, I was an errand boy sent to the library to chase down a book for him, and I did meet him briefly, and maybe shook his hand. I'm a little iffy on my memory, but as I said in the article, I may not have known at the time, or I didn't fully grasp that that he had a distinguished war record in World War II, that he had flown, 35 missions in a B-24 bomber, that he had won the Distinguished Flying Cross for landing that bomber, which had been heavily damaged, and saving the lives of his crew. And yet he never, to my knowledge, he never made a big to-do about his military service, his bravery, the fact that he was decorated. I mean, can you imagine that nowadays? I mean, you had someone like Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who was, I think, in the Naval Reserve, who served for a few months as a driver to a general in Afghanistan. And all you heard Mayor Pete say was about how he was a military veteran, and how he was. I think I saw on his website that he even described himself as a decorated military veteran. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, how can you compare someone like Mayor Pete to a real combat hero like George McGovern? And yet McGovern is remembered today by a lot of people as like, oh, he's that peacenik guy. He's that loser who lost to Nixon. And yet, I think it was precisely because McGovern had seen what war was like, seen war up close, had experienced the horrors and dangers. That was part of why he was so firmly committed to peace. It's easy for someone like Nixon, who played poker, during World War II, and apparently made so much money playing poker that he funneled it into his first political campaign in California. It's easy for someone like Nixon to bomb the Vietnamese in 1972, with B-52s. I don't think that would have been an easy thing for George McGovern to do, because he knew what bombing was about. I don't think he would have done it. And we need to get back to this idea that peace should be our normal. Peace should be normal for democracy, not war. War should not be our normal. And I know I'm preaching to the converted here, but we've now war, since 9/11, people say, since 2001, and that means that if you're a teenager, if you're up to the age of 18, 19, you've never known a United States, you've never known a country when it's been at peace, because allegedly we've always been at war. So what does that teach our young people? It teaches them that war is our normal, and that peace is some fantasy. It's like smoking dope and listening to John Lennon sing Imagine, but peace can't be what we aim for, right? It's like, no, peace should be our normal. And I think McGovern got that. And that's why, people laughed at Dennis Kucinich when he talked about, what was it, 2008, that he's saying, we need a Department of Peace. And it's like, oh my God, a Department of Peace. He's crazy. Right. It's like, why is that crazy? Why aren't we working for peace? And the other part of that is I say, we need to work toward peace because, and I emphasize work, because peace is not easy. Again, people are sort of like, oh, peace, you're that's like, human beings are, we're violent animals and you can't have peace. The world is, competitive and the killing and all that. And it's like, yeah, there is that. Obviously, history shows us that, I've studied military history. I've taught military history. History teaches us that wars happen, but history also shows times of peace. And we should be working a lot harder toward peace than we currently are.
It's interesting how you mentioned that it's in some ways the horror that McGovern had seen, right, and just been a part of, like any of us who've been in war, and probably the way that affected his principles. But I would wonder also, in a way, the way it built his confidence in himself, where here is a candidate who was confident enough that when a geek like me 50 years later, almost goes back and starts collecting his, buttons and shirts from the time, I mean, they had like peace symbols on them. And there was a famous one that said like George McGovern for peace. And he's like letting go of a dove. And it's funny because, Democrats, especially today, wouldn't really try that, in the mainstream establishment. They're so scared of the word dove. I've always said the Democrat dilemma is this idea that they feel they have to tack right in order to like burnish their tough guy. Yep. That just really struck me about what you were saying, that, I never totally thought of it that way, but it's like sometimes the personal is political beyond the platitude there. Like, right. The fact that he was this principled guy who probably was fairly confident in himself and understood with humility what he was and what he wasn't. Like, he was like, yeah, I'm for peace. Whereas if he went to the McKinsey group and got laundered through like whatever robot machine created Mayor Pete as like a newly laundered, born again, like war hero, he didn't go through that, right? He went through flak, right? At whatever 1,000 feet.
Right. Well,
super fascinating. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, Danny, it makes me think of Dwight D. Eisenhower. I mean, only Eisenhower could get up and make the speech that he made in 1961 about the military-industrial complex. I mean, Eisenhower today would be dismissed by the Democrats as a leftist. I know that sounds absurd, but what did any Democrat, other than possibly Tulsi Gabbard, did any Democrat have the balls of somebody like Dwight Eisenhower to warn us about the dangers of the military-industrial complex? And then, of course, there's that famous speech before then, I think it was 1953, where Eisenhower, the Cross of Iron speech, where he talks about every bomber is, 10 high schools and every ship is 5 factories, whatever examples he used. He's there, this is no way of life. This constant building of weapons. This is, if we keep up this militarism, it'll be humanity hanging on a cross of iron. It's like, again, this is a Republican saying this. No Democrat nowadays says anything like that I'm aware of, which is why the only one who came close was Tulsi Gabbard, who he ran as a somewhat anti-war. She was definitely against regime change wars, as she put it. And for doing that, of course, she was smeared as a Russian asset by NBC and by Hillary Clinton, who basically said, yeah, the Russians have their name on a candidate, but But I won't say that candidate's name, Tulsi Gabbard.
And that's interesting. I mean, that's the cost now. It's she was basically essentially, because she's still in the military, right? I mean,
Yes.
she's still so that, I mean, she was accused of treason essentially.
Yes.
I mean, that is if there are libel laws, if they're supposed to even exist, right? If to the extent that you think they're valuable, like, wow, I mean, it's unbelievable. But I've told people who've really screamed about this that, yes, we should scream about it. But as I used to teach in my civil rights class, I'd say, it has always been thus. When you speak out of turn to the sort of powerful war state and, and also just kind of like hyper powerful domestically forces, then they will always historically and conceptually and almost necessarily identify you as somehow less than American, right? You somehow have attachments elsewhere.
Yeah, why wouldn't they? Because I can't even conceive of it, Danny. Who can? But who can conceive of a so-called defense budget, war budget that each year is somewhere around $1 trillion. When you add it all up, when you add up the cost of the wars, the Defense Department, Pentagon budget, the Homeland Security, nuclear weapons as part of the Energy Department, and the VA and everything else. I mean, it's such a vast sum of money, and everyone wants of that. A good friend of mine, he does work in the Beltway area, and he was telling me, he said, I've been to Crystal City, I've been to some of these defense contractors like Lockheed Martin. He said, when you walk into their headquarters buildings in Crystal City and the Beltway, he said, it's like walking into a 5-star hotel. I mean, these places are posh. You can just feel the money. And if you and I or other people are like, hey, we need to cut the defense budget. We need to tackle this. We need to change this. Of course, we're going to get pushed back. I mean, there are people making fortunes off of all this. Just as a random thought, I remember reading in the 1930s that, of course, this is Smedley Butler time, but where, service members, World War I veterans were fighting back then. They said, we're only going to get this under control if we get the profit out of war. And it's like, this is stuff written in the 1930s. And it's like, now look where we are now. At least we had the Nye Commission and the idea that, that being a war profiteer was not a good thing. And we were deploring all these European companies like Vickers and all the rest, or Krupp in Germany, is saying that these were the war profiteers, and we're not like that. And now we're the world's number one weapons manufacturer and distributor. I mean, it's really our big business is selling weapons around the world. We're number one.
Right, USA, we're number one. Well, yeah, God, man, we're definitely gonna have you back, Bill. And maybe we probably need to do just an episode that kind of starts with George McGovern, and then we'll just cover all like the lost cause candidates in history. I feel like we can geek out together on that. But I'm gonna be hopping off to hammer some of these very same points that you're just bringing up with Smedley Butler and with some of this, insider training and or trading and corruption on their Rolodex, which is really what they're hiring a lot of these guys for, right?
Sure.
I'm going to go hammer some of that with Max Blumenthal here in a bit. And I mean, I feel like we can yell about this forever. And in one sense, as I said at his graveside, Smedley Butler in Westchester, Pennsylvania. I was speaking there on the 19th, I believe it was like the 19th anniversary, or maybe it was October 18th. It was the 19th anniversary of the Rangers hitting the ground, I believe. And we were like, not celebrating that, right? We were just saying how obscene this is. And we chose his gravesite. And I had said in my little talk about him, I said, I didn't mention EMN purposely just because of the nature of the event, but, we purposely obviously picked Eisenhower, right, because of the fact that he, was a Republican, even though today he wouldn't be, and that he was a general who spoke out against this stuff. And it's powerful. It's powerful. And I think the Cross of Iron speech is as, or at least, sort of linguistically more powerful, right, in terms of rhetoric. But
Right.
Smedley Butler kind of laid out a lot of the contours to what later gets described by Ike as the military industrial complex, like 30 years before that, and it's super interesting. But so anyway, that's my kind of like plug on EMN, and Henry's going to ask just a little bit about that as we kind of roll out. And I think it's, he's got some thoughts on it, and would like to get your thoughts on, just on the general concept of, Ike, the MIC, and what vets can do in these situations.
Sure.
So Bill, we just want to, it's a, the EMN, it's very new. Still not even entirely sure what all it can possibly grow into as time goes on, but I'm curious to hear, what's your, why was it interesting to you? What kind of areas do you think it'll be critically important to change the discussion a bit? Any of that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, I remember writing a piece for Neiman Watchdog. It was a journalism site, and basically I said that in my article I said is that the media, the networks need to replace the Pentagon cheerleaders on television, on the networks, with real journalists who know something about the military, and I think that's something that I think we need to work towards, because when we watch networks with MSNBC or whatever, you see a lot of the usual suspects. You see retired generals appear, and these retired generals are talking about the Iraq War, or they're talking about Afghanistan or terrorism or whatever. And oftentimes it's someone like General McCaffrey, and oftentimes they still have ties to weapons manufacturers, and they're generally offering you Pentagon talking points. And so that's what people are hearing. They're turning on the news. They're seeing a retired colonel or retired general, and to the normal viewer, it might be like, oh, well, that's reasonable. There's a retired general talking about this. He must know what he's talking about. I'm sure he's giving me a somewhat fair and unbiased opinion, and that simply isn't the case. We really need to create a sort of which is exactly what we're up to in EMN. An alternative to this sort of pro-war, pro-weapons, pro-high defense spending, all of that. We need to create an alternative view. And what I like about EMN is that it has a range of voices. That appealed to me. And what I mean by a range is, it's not just generals and colonels, but okay, you got a major, you got a captain, you got some enlisted people. That's the way it should be. We need to hear from the sergeants or the privates, or just as much as we need to hear from the colonels and the generals. In fact, we need to hear from companies, commanders, and platoon sergeants even more so, because they're the ones at the tip of the spear, as we say. They're the ones who really know what's going on the ground. And so I'm encouraged that EMN has that kind of diversity within, whereas mostly what you see on television and mainstream media is just the usual retired colonels and retired generals, well connected within the Beltway, kind of in many cases basically spouting talking points given to them by the Pentagon.
It has, there is no variance between the Pentagon's position and anybody else. the big 5-sided building has said, this is what we're going to do. So this is what we're going to do. And I'm excited to see what EMN can do on overall in the conversation. But I think that it's going to be even more fun seeing media types have to deal with some of those interviews, having to really be asked hard questions that haven't probably ever been asked to them, or point out things that they themselves didn't know, as often happens to me on the podcast, because
Right.
my range of knowledge is much smaller compared to Danny's, or even yourself, a lot of other people we have on the podcast. Bill, before we close out here today, I was wondering if you could let the listeners know where they can follow your work and what you have coming up in the future.
All right. Well, I have a personal blog, which is Bracing Views. So if they're interested in following my work, they can go to Bracing Views, my site, and I write about a lot of military topics there, but I also occasionally go into other things, because writing about the military all the time, believe it or not, it can get a little tiring.
Yeah, it can be quite
But
bleak.
yeah, and I also write quite a bit for TomDispatch, and TomDispatch, probably some of you already are familiar with that, but that's a great site, carrying a range of views. In fact, in talking with Tom Engelhart, he was one of the first, if not the first, so-called liberal or leftist sites who actually invited military people to write for him. So people like retired Colonel Andy Basovich, myself and Danny. So all credit to Tom Dispatch for connecting people with dissenting military views. So yes, so that's where Bracing Views is my main site, and hopefully people will come and find some articles that they enjoy reading.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed everything I've read there. It's a great resource for people, and also that the we don't there aren't too many dissenting voices from the Air Force overall that within kind of the larger anti-war community. So having someone with your experience, having someone who was in the Air Force, but you were an engineer and you weren't a pilot, so your experience is very, very different than people like Danny or myself. So, well, Bill, thank you so much for coming. I hope that we will talk with you again, which I'm sure you will. And I think that'll do it.
All right. Well, thanks so much for having me. It was fun, and I will say that talking just in our small circle, the EMN circle, it's just encouraging to know sometimes that there are other veterans out there who also have dissenting views or a lot of questions about and a lot of concerns about the path that we're on. There's strength in numbers.
Absolutely, and that's kind of our unofficial motto here at Fortress on a Hill, that we try to let people tell their stories and to understand the nuance that gets you to a position where you say that war cannot be a choice. It can't just be an action that we do without having to defend ourselves or redefine our values in some very, very significant way.
Right. Okay, well, thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, Bill. Talk to you soon. We're on Twitter at Fortress on a Hill, and also at Facebook.com at Fortress on a Hill. You can find our main blog page and our full collection of episodes at www.fortressonahill.com. iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Patreon, Spotify. You name it, almost anywhere you listen, we're already waiting for you. And hey, we're always in the market for more Patreon supporters. Please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com. And if you're not into giving us a monthly payment, think about giving us a couple bucks on PayPal. The link is in the show notes. Skepticism is one's best armor. Never forget it. We'll see you next time.
And listen to my song. I hope you'll pay attention. I will not